Professor Draghi and Minister Kuleba have inevitably touched on the topic of geopolitics, but beyond the conflict in Ukraine, Western democracies are facing a new world order that is drastically different from that of the 20th century. I'd like to begin this next segment with a short video. Now, to shed some light on this complexity, we have two guests today to begin with. Please welcome General Jean-Paul Paloméros, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, together with renowned political economist from the University of Cambridge, Professor Helen Thompson. Now, welcome to you both. We've had some interesting conversations already this morning, and we're going to take off right from there. I'm going to direct my first question to Professor Thompson. We've just heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine, and I'd like to get your perspective. In what ways, according to you, has the war in Ukraine changed geopolitics, and what effect does this have on the world order?
I think that there's many ways in which the world has changed because of Russia's war against Ukraine, but I want to just pick two today. The first of them is about Europe, and Professor Draghi has already spoken about this. I think we need to understand what a shock for Europe having this kind of war is, and what the long-term consequences are for Ukraine as a EU member and as a possible NATO member. Is for Ukraine to be inside the European Union within the next 10, 15 years. That will mean the European Union being a fundamentally different kind of union than it is. It will mean it will need to rethink itself as a peace project because of the fact it will have to engage with Russia as an existential geopolitical rival, threatening directly the security of one of its members. The second way in which the world has geopolitically changed is that it has shown just how difficult it is for the United States and European countries to have non-Western countries accept their perspective on this conflict. So in some ways, what I think has happened as a result of the war is that the China-Russia-Iran axis has strengthened, and that it has now got the potential to bring in some other states, particularly, I think, perhaps Saudi Arabia, into an alliance that is directed against the West and which has a set of common interests around energy that pose some difficulties, I think, for not only Europe, but the United States in some respects too.
You've just mentioned the word shock and some of the possible consequences. I'm going to turn to you, General Paloméros. President Vladimir Zelensky has waged an intensive campaign to ensure Ukraine remains top of mind with very public visits both here in Europe and the US. What role should the US and Europe play in the Russia-Ukraine war, and can diplomacy contribute to its ending at this current stage?
Well, it's not the time of diplomacy. I think everybody understood that, but diplomacy must be there.
As a support.
At least to support the grain exports, the human support, human rights support, this sort of things, but and preparing the next stage, even if it's difficult to see in the fog of war. But in terms of the involvement of the US and EU, I just want to come back in 2014. We had a great summit in Wales. That was the time when Russia annexed illegally Crimea, and our nations were fighting as well against Islamic states. And my command, myself, as the chief of transformation for NATO, 28 countries at this time, we put on the table of the head of states and governments the pledge for reinvestment. And to a great surprise, we achieved that. They decided to reinvest the 2%. So, first and foremost, we have to keep on mobilizing the highest political level for preparing the future. We cannot predict the future, no crystal ball, as it was said, but preparing the future is absolutely crucial, whatever it could be. Secondly, now the US. Well, the US are the superpower, $800 billion of defense budget, a huge industry, weapons, armament industry, and they are the main supplier of Ukraine. We must face the fact that without the US, a sovereign Ukraine will no longer be there. So now the second question is, for how long? Nobody knows. So this is where the European, which has done as much as they could. It was not enough, perhaps, but considering the situation and their own defense budget, they've put on the table, more or less, if I accept the fighter jets, okay, but except that, they've really done what they could. But we see the limits as well, because we have kept, I speak of the UK, Germany, and France, certainly, we have kept the objective of getting qualitative tools to deal with all the crises that we have had to face. But on the other hand, we have reduced the quantity because we thought it was not, we couldn't cope with quantity because of the limitation of the budget and because we thought that was not indispensable. And now what is demonstrated in Ukraine, that quantity is a quality by itself, that we need the mass, and we cannot produce that. So my first and foremost pledge would be, well, we have to resurrect in certain way this spirit, and as there is the Le Bourget show in Paris as well, and to reinvest seriously in the defense industry. And this is not an option. This is not an option. If we need that, if we really want to mean what we say, helping Ukraine, preparing the future will be different. We are entering a new phase. I hope it will not be a Cold War phase 4 or 4.0, but who knows? I mean, after this war, there will be a separation. There will be countries on the side and others. Unfortunately, for the time being, Ukraine is on the bad side. This is not their fault. This is how it happened. And to conclude, I think that the only, and Mr. Draghi has touched that upon, the only security guarantee for Ukraine on deep future is being part both of the EU and NATO. I cannot see another guarantee for these people, which are very courageous, who are doing a lot of things by themselves, who are showing us the pace for freedom, democracy, liberty. They are at the forefront of the fight.
You've touched on a lot of topics we spoke about this afternoon. Another topic is, of course, energy. The invasion of Ukraine has transformed energy politics and disrupted supply chains worldwide. We heard it. Can you explain how the war has affected this energy politics and what further changes do you see on the horizon? Again, we don't have a crystal ball, but what can we imagine?
I think the first thing to say here is that Europe has experienced a very serious energy shock. The fact that in many ways European governments have coped with that shock better than might have been expected before the war doesn't change the magnitude of that shock. It is a very different world in which most European countries are now competing for liquid natural gas imports, which is more expensive actually more carbon intensive as well than it is the one in which they were importing pipeline gas from Russia. And I think that this shock occurred in a context in which it was already clear in 2021 that gas markets were fundamentally changing, and that was because China's demand for liquid natural gas rose so dramatically during the course of 2021. So what we now really have is a world of structural Eurasian competition for liquid natural gas supply, in which European countries have prevailed because they've been able to price some of the poorer Asian countries like Pakistan out of those markets, and because China's demand was weak during the course of 2022. Now, I think that there was a way, perhaps even until the last month, of thinking that maybe China's leadership had decided that actually they needed to pull back a bit from that competition, that they were at a disadvantage in this new world. But the fact that in the last few weeks it's become clear that China's signing a new big long-term liquid natural gas deal with Qatar shows, I think, that that's not the case, and China will not be withdrawing from that competition. I think the other thing that's changed is that Russia is now still a energy exporting superpower, but it is one in which its maritime power is more important than pipelines, that the Arctic Passage, the Great Northern Sea Route, is going to become more and more significant, and that this actually poses some dilemmas for China, because China doesn't want to make itself overly dependent upon Russia's supply. It doesn't want to be in a position where we've basically divided the world up geographically where oil and gas is concerned, at least in Eurasia, so that Europe goes to the Middle East and Russian oil goes to China and India. China wants diversity of supply. It wants to still be very much in the Middle East, and I think that's the context in which we should understand the role that China's played in re-establishing diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that, I think, is part of that story in which OPEC Plus, so the oil cartel based on the Saudi-Russian alliance, getting closer to China, that is a geopolitical shift that has come out of the war that is consequential and will continue to play out in the future.
That we couldn't have anticipated if the war hadn't arrived.
I think that aspects of it were there. China was obviously close to Iran before the war came, but I think that this commitment to trying to make sure that it's close to as many OPEC Plus members as possible is a result of the war, because they don't want to get boxed into the Russia dependency.
I want to stay on China for a moment there, because for years the US has described China as a rising power. However, China has already risen, I think it's fair to say. General Paloméros, what does this mean for the US-China relationship, and what about the global economy and international security as a whole?
Well, this is a challenge of the 21st century. I think everybody has understood that. First and foremost, for those who go in DC and meet in the different state of department, defense department, China is an obsession in the US for certain reasons. For certain good reasons. I mean, the raising and the important defense investment, it's not new. It's been there for almost 10 years. But it was silent and nobody cared, actually. And suddenly we discovered that they are able to produce 3 times as a speed, which is 3 times higher than in the US, for instance, for their Navy. Speak about maritime power. Mm-hmm. So they're impressive. They are able to do a lot of things. They have no operational experience, so we cannot say whether if they will be good or not. But they have been investing on technology. They have been investing on numbers. They have been investing on high-end capability. So on the other hand, we have this competition. And I must stress as well that most of the big threats, cyber threats against Europe or the United States come from China, to be clear. Some from Russia, yeah, but most of them, and it's open press. So what we do, we leave these 2 mega planets in a collision course, or we try to influence that. This is the point. First and foremost, we can try to influence the leaders, saying, well, you cannot keep on pretending that you are cooperating while you are fighting each other. So
They do a good job of pretending to.
yeah, but there are limits to that. So can we offer another way, a kind of balance in this ecosystem, this solar system, with other planets? I'm fully convinced that with many countries, and I discovered how much the weight of so-called small countries is important in NATO. Every country has its own voice, and this is good. And this is exactly what we need. We need to go to, in India. I know that you are invested in, many of you, in India. That's a good place, I think. We need to go to Africa, not as a whole. I don't feel that we can address Africa as a whole. We need to be more specific. And obviously South America, and to see how we can develop together the world of the future in a certain way and influence the pace of these two planets, so they will see that there is a third ways to look at the world in the future. So, because everything, the collision course is there, for sure. What will happen with Taiwan is another story. I don't think there will be a war for that, but the Chinese will keep on influencing, and one day or the other, they will take the hanging fruits in a certain way. This is my way of looking, but that increased the
Tension.
the pace. And last but not least, we must remind ourselves that those are both super nuclear powers, member of the P5, member of the Council, Security Council. And perhaps it is the time to make this Security Council work on those issues. I mean, China must be integrated in the overall vision and agreements on nuclear. They are not so far. And I would say France as well, as a major power. So it's time to renew that in the light of what is happening as well in Russia and Belarus today. It's time to be serious about nuclear deterrence. You know, I'm feeling that now we have taken a dangerous path in that domain.
Some of the geopolitical shifts between the US and China that we've just heard about, how is that affecting and shaking up Europe?
I think that one thing we should talk about here is the Inflation Reduction Act, which Mr. Draghi mentioned earlier. This is, I think, in a way, as important a development during 2022 as the war itself in understanding the geopolitical world. And while clearly there is a domestic purpose to the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as an attempt to address the climate crisis, there's very clearly a geopolitical purpose to it, which is to try to break China's present dominance of the metal supply chains necessary for the energy transition. That you can't understand the Inflation Reduction Act without seeing it in terms of Chinese-American geopolitical competition. And in that sense, it poses like real questions for Europe, whether it's possible for the European Union, let alone a country like the United Kingdom, to match what the United States is going to do. The answer is probably very difficult to do that, even for the European Union. And if that's so, then the question becomes, how does the European Union and individual European countries position themselves in relation to China-centric supply chains or American-centric supply chains? And I think that question then has some potential to be divisive within Europe, because there is one country, obviously, Germany, which has a rather different industrial relationship with China right now than any other European country does. And in some sense, if you say, what's the subtext of economic competition of Made in China 2025, to which the Inflation Reduction Act was in part a response, the answer would be to replace Germany, particularly in something like the components for vehicles. China now dominates electric vehicle exports, and that has, I think, particular consequences for Germany. So I think that the ways in which the energy transition plays out poses serious questions for the European Union as a whole, and for Germany in particular.
Thank you. I want us to turn to defence for a moment. Do you see a credible path towards a functioning European defence strategy?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think European Union have understood, I think, hopefully, that he cannot no longer travel in the first class with a ticket of second class. And that's exactly what had happened through the years as far as defense is concerned. We have to pay the price of our defense, our freedom, our liberty. So now, how we can achieve that? There are a lot of good ideas, and you see that the European defense is building step by step, I would say. But this is not a strategy. This is a hope. Hope is not a strategy. So we need a clear vision. It's not as easy as that, because a lot of countries say, well, now we have, out of 31 NATO countries, we have 22 European. If Sweden join, 23 out of 32. Why should we have this two-path approach to defense while we have NATO? Being a former commander of NATO, I can tell you that, and from my perspective, the main mission of NATO, and today even more than yesterday, is to provide a credible, sound, collective defense, to prevent, to deter, and it works. Ask to the Baltic states, ask to Romania, ask to the new countries coming in the Balkans. They appreciate that. Ask to the Ukrainian, the difference. So NATO is there, and we must keep this path for NATO. European defense is something different, because with the European defense you can address a lot of questions which have been raised very wisely by Mr. Draghi, which are very linked. You cannot address defense as a single pillar. We must really address the complexity of the world, and the European Union have a lot of assets, the skills, the brains, the ability to invent science and technology. So all of that should be put in an ambition. So what is the ambition of Europe for the future? And taking the words of Mr. Draghi, a single common market? No way. This is not the future. This is economics, and not even more economics. It's just market. So for me, what Ukraine is demonstrating to us is our values, freedom and democracy, deserve much better than that. And it's the time for Europeans to find their way, their place, and to define what is the clear objective and what is the strategy which could help them to fulfill this strategy. It's not so difficult. I mean, addressing the digital transformation together, addressing the need for raw materials, addressing the rare earths, addressing the health together, as we have seen during the COVID, and improving the real innovation process. We have no DARPA in Europe. We have no DARPA. We have not a single agency which is able to dare and to prepare the future and invest in the future.
And like Dr. Draghi said, we can't abandon the ambitious dream for Europe. Final question, one word each to each of you, because we're moving on with time. Professor Thompson, how does reliance on Russian gas affect EU integration? Are we simply replacing one historical alliance with new energy dependence? In just a couple of words.
First of all, I want to say that we're not leaving Russian energy dependency behind, certainly if we stay with nuclear power. And secondly, there is a very real risk that in the low-carbon energy world that we're going to replace Russian energy dependency with metal dependency in parts of the global south in ways that are going to create some quite difficult, not just political, but ethical questions for Europe.
Coming forward. And a final question. In your view, will more geopolitical tensions and a fragmented world threaten trade relationships and financial stability, and how? I know that's hard in just a couple of words, but I have confidence in you.
We need to assume a transformation together. There is no time to take the topic, the main issues in a single way, if I may say so, in a single track. We have to address the complexity of the world as it is, and we have to make sure that we navigate this new world together. And this kind of interaction is absolutely crucial in my way. We cannot separate defense from, as I said, from the different perspective, artificial intelligence, and we need, and that will be my conclusion, to invest in human intelligence. Human intelligence will be the key, not only for Europe, but for the planet, if I may say so. And if we can foster that through a European project, we will have helped our world to be better tomorrow.
Professor Thompson, General Paloméros, thank you very much for your insights.